The storm on Arctos V was like no other. The sky was dark, filled with swirling clouds, and the ocean below was churning in wild chaos. Waves rose higher than buildings, crashing against the rocks that jutted out of the water. It was a dangerous place for any kind of travel, especially by sea. Ethan stood on the bridge of the Galactic Alliance hovercraft, watching the storm unfold outside. His face was serious, his hands firmly gripping the controls. He had been stationed on Arctos V for nearly a year now, tasked with providing rescue and aid in the dangerous conditions of the planet. Most of the time, it was quiet, but sometimes, like today, the weather became a real threat. "Another distress signal coming through," said Lieutenant Juno, his fellow pilot. She pointed to the blinking red light on the console. "It's faint, but it's from the northeast. Someone's in trouble." Ethan frowned. The storm had worsened, and no one in their right mind would be out there in the open waters. Yet the signal was real. Someone was calling for help. Without thinking twice, he grabbed the control stick. "Prepare for a rough ride. We're going in." Juno hesitated for a moment, looking at him with concern. "Ethan, the storm is getting worse. It's too dangerous." He didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the display. Ethan had always been a man of action, especially when it came to saving lives. He wasn't going to let anyone suffer if he could help. "Get ready," he said, and with that, the hovercraft shot forward, cutting through the thick air and turbulent waters. The storm made it hard to see anything beyond the flashing lights and rain. As they moved closer to the source of the signal, the waves seemed to grow even taller, crashing against the sides of the hovercraft. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the rain poured down in sheets. Ethan's focus never wavered. His training kicked in, and he pushed the hovercraft faster, narrowly dodging the massive waves that threatened to flip them over. His heart raced, but he wasn't afraid. The need to help was stronger than any fear he felt. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The storm seemed endless, and just as Ethan thought he couldn't take the pressure anymore, he saw something in the distance. It was faint at first, just a shadow against the dark sea. But then he saw it more clearly, a ship sinking in the raging waters. "It's a transport ship," Juno called out, her voice shaky. "They're not going to make it out of there without help." Ethan didn't hesitate. He steered the hovercraft toward the wreckage. The waves were relentless, but he didn't slow down. As they approached, he saw bodies in the water, struggling to stay afloat. A few of them waved their arms, calling for help, but Ethan's eyes were drawn to one figure in particular. A young woman was clinging to a piece of debris, her body weak from exhaustion. Her face was barely visible, but there was something about her. She looked different. Her skin had a soft glow, like she wasn't entirely human. She had long, flowing hair that shimmered with hints of silver and blue. "Hang on," Ethan shouted, pulling the hovercraft closer. He didn't know who she was, but he couldn't just leave her there. He threw a rope to her, but the waves were too strong. The woman struggled to reach it. Her hand slipped, and she started to disappear beneath the water. Without a second thought, Ethan jumped out of the hovercraft. The cold water hit him like a wall, but he pushed through it. His arms cut through the waves as he swam toward the woman. Every stroke felt harder than the last, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, he reached her. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open just for a moment before closing again. Ethan could feel her weakness. He pulled her closer, holding her up as best as he could. "Stay with me," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. With one final effort, he managed to get her back to the hovercraft. She was limp in his arms, barely breathing. Ethan didn't waste a second. He laid her down on the deck, his heart pounding as he checked for a pulse. "She's alive," he muttered to himself, relief flooding his chest. "Come on, breathe." He started CPR, pressing his hands to her chest, trying to force air back into her lungs. For a moment, it felt like the storm would take everything from them both, but then the alien woman's chest rose with a sharp breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gasped for air. Her voice was weak, a soft, melodic sound that barely carried over the storm. Who are you?" she whispered, looking up at him with a mix of confusion and gratitude. The storm on Arctos V was like no other. The sky was dark, filled with swirling clouds, and the ocean below was churning in wild chaos. Waves rose higher than buildings, crashing against the rocks that jutted out of the water. It was a dangerous place for any kind of travel, especially by sea. Ethan stood on the bridge of the Galactic Alliance hovercraft, watching the storm unfold outside. His face was serious, his hands firmly gripping the controls. He had been stationed on Arctos V for nearly a year now, tasked with providing rescue and aid in the dangerous conditions of the planet. Most of the time, it was quiet, but sometimes, like today, the weather became a real threat. "Another distress signal coming through," said Lieutenant Juno, his fellow pilot. She pointed to the blinking red light on the console. "It's faint, but it's from the northeast. Someone's in trouble." Ethan frowned. The storm had worsened, and no one in their right mind would be out there in the open waters. Yet the signal was real. Someone was calling for help. Without thinking twice, he grabbed the control stick. "Prepare for a rough ride. We're going in." Juno hesitated for a moment, looking at him with concern. "Ethan, the storm is getting worse. It's too dangerous." He didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the display. Ethan had always been a man of action, especially when it came to saving lives. He wasn't going to let anyone suffer if he could help. "Get ready," he said, and with that, the hovercraft shot forward, cutting through the thick air and turbulent waters. The storm made it hard to see anything beyond the flashing lights and rain. As they moved closer to the source of the signal, the waves seemed to grow even taller, crashing against the sides of the hovercraft. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the rain poured down in sheets. Ethan's focus never wavered. His training kicked in, and he pushed the hovercraft faster, narrowly dodging the massive waves that threatened to flip them over. His heart raced, but he wasn't afraid. The need to help was stronger than any fear he felt. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The storm seemed endless, and just as Ethan thought he couldn't take the pressure anymore, he saw something in the distance. It was faint at first, just a shadow against the dark sea. But then he saw it more clearly, a ship sinking in the raging waters. "It's a transport ship," Juno called out, her voice shaky. "They're not going to make it out of there without help." Ethan didn't hesitate. He steered the hovercraft toward the wreckage. The waves were relentless, but he didn't slow down. As they approached, he saw bodies in the water, struggling to stay afloat. A few of them waved their arms, calling for help, but Ethan's eyes were drawn to one figure in particular. A young woman was clinging to a piece of debris, her body weak from exhaustion. Her face was barely visible, but there was something about her. She looked different. Her skin had a soft glow, like she wasn't entirely human. She had long, flowing hair that shimmered with hints of silver and blue. "Hang on," Ethan shouted, pulling the hovercraft closer. He didn't know who she was, but he couldn't just leave her there. He threw a rope to her, but the waves were too strong. The woman struggled to reach it. Her hand slipped, and she started to disappear beneath the water. Without a second thought, Ethan jumped out of the hovercraft. The cold water hit him like a wall, but he pushed through it. His arms cut through the waves as he swam toward the woman. Every stroke felt harder than the last, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, he reached her. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open just for a moment before closing again. Ethan could feel her weakness. He pulled her closer, holding her up as best as he could. "Stay with me," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. With one final effort, he managed to get her back to the hovercraft. She was limp in his arms, barely breathing. Ethan didn't waste a second. He laid her down on the deck, his heart pounding as he checked for a pulse. "She's alive," he muttered to himself, relief flooding his chest. "Come on, breathe." He started CPR, pressing his hands to her chest, trying to force air back into her lungs. For a moment, it felt like the storm would take everything from them both, but then the alien woman's chest rose with a sharp breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gasped for air. Her voice was weak, a soft, melodic sound that barely carried over the storm. Who are you?" she whispered, looking up at him with a mix of confusion and gratitude. "Do you have any idea where the Desolates are?" Ethan asked. "How long do we have before they catch up to us?" Lyrana's expression grew more serious, her eyes darkening once again. "They could be anywhere by now. I don't know how they found us, but they are relentless. They know I'm alive, and they know I have the blueprint." Ethan's grip tightened on the console in front of him. He wasn't going to let anyone harm Lyrana, not while he was here. He stood up, determination clear in his eyes. "We're not waiting around for them to find us," he said firmly. "Let's get this blueprint to safety. We leave now." Lyrana nodded, her eyes meeting his with an expression of deep gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan. You don't know what this means to me." "You don't need to thank me," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I made a promise to you. We're in this together, and we'll get through it." With a final glance out the window at the dark, swirling storm, Ethan prepared the hovercraft for their journey. The storm outside wasn't going to stop them. Neither was the threat of the Desolates. They had a mission, and nothing was going to get in their way. The hovercraft cut through the storm, its engines humming steadily despite the violent wind and rain outside. Ethan kept his eyes focused on the controls, adjusting the craft's speed and altitude as they moved closer to the dangerous waters that held the hidden facility. He had already activated the advanced underwater navigation system, and the small screen in front of him flickered with digital maps showing the location. Lyrana sat quietly beside him, her eyes never leaving the window. She was deep in thought, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She knew what was at stake. It wasn't just the blueprint anymore. It was the future of her people. She had no choice but to trust Ethan. And so far, he had shown nothing but kindness and courage. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, but he remained calm, determined to follow through. He glanced at Lyrana, noticing the way her fingers nervously tapped the side of her seat. He could tell that the journey ahead was weighing heavily on her. "You okay?" he asked softly, trying to break the silence. Lyrana turned to him, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "I'm fine. Just worried." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "I get it. But we're in this together. We'll make it through." She nodded, though her mind seemed far away. I've never been this close to the facility before. It's a place my people have kept hidden for so long. No one has dared to approach it for fear of the dangers down there." "The volcano trench," Ethan muttered under his breath. He had read the data on it before, and it wasn't comforting. The trench was a dangerous, unstable area, filled with unpredictable currents and deep-sea creatures that humans had never fully studied. "I've dealt with worse." Lyrana gave him a look, though her eyes were filled with a mix of doubt and gratitude. "I hope you're right." The hovercraft flew in silence for several more hours. Outside, the storm began to die down, though the heavy waves continued to batter the sea below. Ethan's focus never wavered as he guided the craft toward the underwater trench. His mission now felt clearer than ever: protect Lyrana and help her secure the blueprint before the Desolates could strike. Finally, the ocean below them began to change. The water grew darker, and the massive, jagged cliffs of the volcanic trench came into view. Ethan slowed the hovercraft, his eyes scanning the depths beneath them. "There it is," Lyrana whispered, her voice filled with awe. Ethan turned his gaze toward the bottom of the trench. The facility was there, hidden among the rocky seafloor, cloaked by natural forces that protected it from all but the most determined explorers. The ocean around them was still, silent. "Are we sure this is the place?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Lyrana nodded. "Yes, it's hidden deep, but it's the only safe location for the blueprint. Ethan breathed deeply and adjusted the craft's position. It was time to dive deeper into the trench. As they descended, the pressure in the water increased. The walls of the trench grew steeper, towering like dark giants on either side of them. Ethan adjusted the craft's controls, moving them slowly deeper into the heart of the trench. They were moving into unknown waters, and every decision had to be precise. Then something caught Ethan's attention. A shadow moving in the distance. It was massive, and it didn't look like anything he had ever seen before. They reached the central chamber, where a massive pedestal stood at the center of the room. On it was a small glowing orb, a piece of technology unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It hummed softly, casting an ethereal glow across the chamber. Lyrana approached it carefully, her hands trembling. This was what she had been sent to protect, the final piece of her people's hope. The blueprint for the energy device, now housed within this orb, was a key that could save or destroy everything. Ethan stood a few steps behind her, watching quietly. He could see the weight of the moment in Lyrana's eyes. She had come so far, and now the final piece of the puzzle was within her reach. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The blueprint. The device. It's inside." Ethan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the glowing orb. It was beautiful, almost otherworldly. He had never seen anything like it before, but he could feel its power, a raw, untamed energy that pulsed from it like a living thing. Lyrana carefully reached for the orb, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. As soon as she touched it, the symbols on the walls flickered to life, glowing brighter, as though responding to the orb's energy. The air around them seemed to hum with power. "Lyrana," Ethan began, his voice full of caution. "Are you sure this is the right decision?" Lyrana paused, her fingers lingering on the orb. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes lost in thought. Finally, she turned to Ethan, her face solemn. "This is the only way. We have no other choice. If we don't stop the desolates now, it will be too late." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He could see that Lyrana was torn, but there was no other path forward. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. Just as Lyrana lifted the orb from its pedestal, a loud, sudden noise echoed through the facility. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath them shook. Ethan spun around, instinctively reaching for his blaster. He could feel it. Something was wrong. "What's happening?" Lyrana cried, her face pale with fear. "They found us," Ethan muttered, his eyes scanning the shadows of the chamber. "The desolates. They're here." The facility's lights flickered as the ground shook again. From the darkness ahead, a shadowy figure appeared, a soldier of the desolates, moving swiftly toward them. It was only the first of many. Lyrana gripped the orb tighter. She wasn't going to let them take it. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "We need to go. Now," Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the exit. The fight was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The sound of boots echoing down the dark hallways of the facility was enough to make Ethan's blood run cold. He pulled Lyrana close to him, instinctively placing himself between her and the approaching danger. His hand reached for the blaster holstered at his side, but his thoughts were racing. They had no time to waste. They had to get out before the desolates closed in on them. "What do we do now?" Lyrana asked, her voice filled with panic. She was clutching the glowing orb tightly, her knuckles white. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His mind was working quickly. The sound of the desolate soldiers grew louder, and he knew there was no way they'd be able to fight them all off. There were too many. They needed a plan. He glanced around the chamber, searching for an escape route. The walls of the facility were lined with large metallic doors, but which one led to safety? There was no time to investigate them all. "Follow me," Ethan said firmly, taking Lyrana's arm and pulling her toward one of the doors at the far side of the room. It was their only option. He could hear the desolate soldiers getting closer, their footsteps echoing like a countdown to disaster. As they sprinted toward the door, the first desolate soldier appeared in the doorway, blocking their path. The soldier was tall, with dark armor that seemed to shimmer with a cold, unearthly glow. His eyes, glowing a menacing red, fixed on them immediately. Lyrana gasped, but Ethan reacted without hesitation. He reached for his blaster and fired, the shot ringing out in the still air. The energy blast hit the soldier square in the chest, but it didn't seem to do much damage. The soldier staggered back, but quickly recovered, his red eyes narrowing as he raised a weapon of his own. "We need to keep moving," Ethan shouted, pulling Lyrana away from the soldier. He fired again, this time aiming for the soldier's legs. The blast hit its mark, but the soldier remained standing, unfazed. Lyrana placed the orb against a small device embedded in the door's surface. A soft hum filled the air as the device began to read the orb's data. The symbols on the orb glowed brighter, and the humming grew louder, filling the room with a sense of power. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the door shuddered under the impact of something heavy hitting it. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The desolates were here. "Lyrana, hurry," Ethan shouted, his voice full of urgency. Lyrana's hands moved quickly, her fingers dancing over the controls on the device. She could feel the pressure mounting, but she didn't falter. She had come too far to give up now. The hum of the orb reached a crescendo, and with a final click, the door slid open with a soft whoosh. Without wasting a second, Ethan grabbed Lyrana's arm and pulled her inside the control room. The door slammed shut behind them, just as the first desolate soldier rounded the corner, slamming into the door with a loud crash. Inside, the control room was bathed in a soft, blue light, the walls covered in intricate consoles and displays. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. The room was both ancient and advanced, as though it had been built to withstand the test of time. "Where do we go?" Lyrana asked, her voice shaking slightly. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the main console. It had to be here somewhere. The key to activating the defense systems and protecting the blueprint. "There," he said, pointing to a large console in the center of the room. It was covered in glowing symbols and alien technology, but the basic controls were familiar. This was where they could turn the tide. Lyrana moved toward the console, her fingers brushing the surface. As she did, the console flickered to life, the symbols shifting and changing before her eyes. She could feel the power in the room, the energy flowing through her fingertips as she activated the system. "Activating defense systems," a voice echoed from the console, the words in an ancient language, but Lyrana could understand them. Ethan's heart raced as the room began to shake. He could feel the energy building, the walls humming with power. The desolates were still outside, pounding on the door, desperate to break in. "Is it working?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. Lyrana nodded, her eyes focused on the console. "Almost there. Just a few more seconds." The door shook again as the desolates slammed into it once more, their attacks growing stronger, more focused. But Ethan didn't look back. His attention was fixed on Lyrana and on the console. They were so close. With one final press of the button, the room filled with a bright light. The energy from the defense systems surged to life, and the walls hummed with an intense power. The air crackled with electricity, and Ethan could feel the tension in the room. "Now," Lyrana shouted. A powerful wave of energy shot out from the control room, flowing through the facility and radiating outward into the surrounding ocean. The desolates outside screamed in shock as the energy blasted through the walls, pushing them back with an overwhelming force. Ethan and Lyrana stood in the center of the control room, their faces lit by the bright blue glow. The blast had been enough to stop the desolates in their tracks, but they knew it was only a temporary solution. The desolates would come back, and they would have to be ready. Lyrana turned to Ethan, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it." The blueprint is safe. Ethan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. We did it together. But their victory was bittersweet. The battle was far from over. The desolates would return, and they would be stronger than ever. They couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. We'll be ready, Ethan said, his voice filled with determination. We'll fight for the future, and together they would stand against the darkness that threatened to consume their world. Ethan smiled, though his heart was still racing. I'm Ethan. You're safe now. The woman blinked a few times, her gaze focusing on him. You saved me. Ethan nodded. That's what I do. Ethan sat beside the alien woman, watching as her breathing slowly returned to normal. She still looked weak, her eyes fluttering every now and then as though she was fighting to stay awake. Her skin, which had once shimmered like the surface of a calm ocean, was now pale and damp, clinging to her delicate frame. Are you okay? Ethan asked gently, offering her a small smile. His voice was calm, though he was still shaken by the storm they had just survived. The woman's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. She looked up at him, confusion in her gaze. It was clear she had no idea who he was or what had happened. Her lips parted slightly as though trying to speak, but her voice barely made a sound. Easy now, Ethan murmured, his tone soothing. He reached for a nearby blanket and draped it gently over her shoulders. Her eyes followed his every movement with a quiet intensity. What happened? She finally whispered, her voice hoarse and fragile. Where am I? Ethan took a deep breath. You were in the water. Your ship, it sank in the storm. I rescued you. You're safe now. The woman's brow furrowed, her face clouded with confusion. She glanced around the hovercraft, taking in her surroundings. It wasn't the familiar setting of a ship or station that she had expected. Thank you for saving me, she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know you. Ethan smiled reassuringly. You don't have to. I'm just glad I could help. He paused for a moment, wondering if she needed something else but unsure how to approach the situation. Her eyes met his again, and for the first time, they seemed to clear. There was recognition there, but it wasn't of Ethan. It was as if something was clicking into place in her mind. Who are you? Ethan asked softly, trying to understand her better. I mean, you're different. Are you from around here? The woman hesitated, then seemed to take a moment to gather her thoughts. She was clearly still trying to make sense of the situation. She pulled the blanket tightly around her and sat up slightly, wincing a little as she did so. I'm Lyrana, she said, her voice steadying as she spoke her name. I'm from the Sirenian species, a race that lives in the oceans of Arctos V. My people are different from yours. She looked down at her hands, noticing the webbing between her fingers. It was almost like a reminder of her origin. Ethan nodded, still absorbing the information. Sirenian. Okay, I've heard of your species before. You're aquatic, right? Lyrana gave a small nod. Yes, we live underwater. We have different abilities than humans, but I'm not sure how to explain them yet. That's okay, Ethan replied. You've been through a lot. We'll take it slow. Lyrana's eyes softened as she looked at him. Thank you, Ethan. I don't know how to repay you. Ethan smiled, trying to ease her worry. You don't have to repay me. It's what I do. Help when I can. Lyrana's lips trembled slightly as though she wanted to say more, but instead, she simply nodded. Her mind seemed far away, her thoughts lost in what had happened. Ethan noticed how exhausted she looked and wondered what had brought her here in the first place. The sinking ship, the pirates, everything. It didn't make sense. You mentioned pirates, Ethan asked, trying to get more information. What were they after? Lyrana's face darkened slightly, her expression hardening. She looked away for a moment, as if weighing whether to share her story. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter, more serious. They attacked us, because I was on that ship. I was carrying something important for my people, something that could change everything. She glanced at Ethan, her gaze intense. The pirates were hired by a rival faction. They want to stop us, destroy everything we've worked for. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary rescue. He had pulled Lyrana out of the water, but now he understood there was much more at stake. She wasn't just some survivor from a wrecked ship. She was carrying something vital, something powerful. And those pirates wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Do you know who they are?" Ethan asked, his voice serious now. "What's this something you're talking about?" Lyrana hesitated, clearly torn. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to decide how much to trust him. Finally, she spoke. "Go, now." Ethan urged Lyrana, his voice urgent. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no time for a prolonged fight. They needed to escape, and fast. Lyrana nodded, her face filled with fear but determination. Together, they sprinted past the soldier, heading down the hallway toward the exit. Behind them, the desolate soldier roared in frustration, his footsteps thundering as he chased after them. The hallway was long and winding, but Ethan knew it like the back of his hand. He had studied the facility's blueprints before, memorizing every corner, every door, every hidden passage. He pushed forward, his eyes scanning every inch of the walls, searching for their way out. There, Lyrana pointed to a small door at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was a maintenance hatch, one of the hidden exits they had hoped to use in case of emergency. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran toward it, his pulse quickening as he reached for the door. Just as he touched the handle, the loud, menacing roar of the desolate soldier filled the hallway. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They weren't going to make it unless they acted fast. With a forceful push, Ethan threw open the maintenance hatch, revealing a narrow, dark passage that led deep into the bowels of the facility. Without looking back, he grabbed Lyrana's hand and pulled her inside. "Quickly," he urged, his voice low but filled with urgency. They had no time to waste. The desolates were closing in on them. The hatch slammed shut behind them, leaving the sounds of the chase muffled. The narrow passageway was dark, the air damp and thick with the scent of old machinery. Ethan led the way, his senses alert as they moved deeper into the unknown. "We need to find a way out of here," Lyrana said, her voice trembling but strong. "The desolates will be after us. They won't stop until they get the orb." Ethan nodded, his mind already working through their options. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning like a maze. There was no way to know if they were heading in the right direction, but they couldn't stop now. As they moved further down the passage, the faint glow of emergency lights illuminated their path. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of what they were facing. Ethan knew they couldn't outrun the desolates forever. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Lyrana suddenly stopped, her hand grabbing Ethan's arm. "There's something ahead," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Ethan turned to look. In the distance, a faint blue light glimmered in the dark. It was different from the emergency lights, brighter, more focused. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his heart racing. Was it another trap? Lyrana's eyes widened as she recognized what it was. "It's the control room," she said softly. "The heart of the facility. If we can reach it, we can activate the defense systems. We can protect the blueprint and stop the desolates." Ethan's eyes lit up with hope. This was their chance. But they had to move fast. The desolates were still after them, and time was running out. Together, they pressed forward, their determination stronger than ever. The control room was close, and with it, the future of both their worlds. Ethan and Lyrana moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the hidden facility. The control room was just ahead, the faint blue glow growing brighter as they neared their destination. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The desolates were still after them, relentless in their pursuit. Time was running out. "There it is," Lyrana whispered, her voice filled with a mix of hope and fear. She could see the control room ahead, a large door that was secured with multiple locks. But that door was their only chance now. They had to get inside. Ethan nodded, his expression hardening with determination. "We'll make it. Just stay close." As they approached the door, Ethan quickly checked the area for any signs of danger. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The Desolates had grown stronger, faster, and more determined since they'd started their journey. He could hear their footsteps, distant but drawing closer, getting louder with every passing second. Lyrana stepped forward, placing the orb carefully in her hands. "I need to unlock this," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. The glowing orb she carried contained the blueprint for the energy device, and it was the key to activating the control room's defenses. Ethan took a step back, positioning himself in front of the door. "Do it quickly. We don't have much time." "Lyrana, do you see that?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but concerned. Lyrana leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she peered into the depths. Her expression instantly shifted, turning serious. "I see it." The shadow was moving closer now, and as it neared, the craft's sensors picked up a sudden shift in the water's pressure. Something was approaching. Something big. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Lyrana's eyes were wide now, but there was no fear in them. Just determination. "A guardian. It's one of the creatures that protect the entrance to the facility. We need to pass it if we want to get inside." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had heard about these creatures, massive, ancient beings that had lived in the trench for centuries. Their job was to defend the hidden facility from intruders. "We'll have to outsmart it," Lyrana added, her voice calm despite the rising tension. "It won't attack unless it feels threatened. If we stay calm, it will let us through." Ethan nodded, but his grip tightened on the controls. The massive shadow was now moving directly toward them, and he could see the outline of a creature that resembled a serpent, its sleek body coiling and twisting through the water like an ancient leviathan. "Stay calm," Lyrana repeated, her eyes never leaving the creature. "Just stay calm." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to focus. He adjusted the hovercraft's speed, slowing down until it moved almost like a drifting leaf. He kept the craft steady, never making any sudden movements. The creature circled them, studying them with its glowing eyes. The tension in the air was thick. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his focus. He was determined to get through this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the creature stopped. It hovered for a moment, then slowly moved aside, allowing them to pass. Ethan exhaled in relief. That was close. Lyrana smiled, her eyes bright. "We made it. Now we're almost there." They were at the entrance of the hidden facility. The journey had only just begun. The entrance to the hidden facility loomed before them, an imposing structure carved into the very rock of the ocean trench. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, faintly glowing with a soft blue light that seemed to pulse with life. The air inside was cool, the hum of energy that filled the space both calming and powerful. This was no ordinary facility. This was a place of great importance, a sanctuary for secrets long forgotten by most. Ethan slowly guided the hovercraft into the facility's docking bay, the craft's engines making a soft, steady hum as it came to a halt. The underwater lights flickered to life, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Lyrana sat still beside him, her eyes locked on the entrance. She was nervous, her hand gripping the edge of the seat. Even after everything that had happened, even after the terrifying encounter with the guardian creature, she still had doubts. "This place," she whispered, "it's the heart of everything we've worked for." Ethan turned to her, offering a reassuring smile. "We're here. We'll get through this." Lyrana nodded, her thoughts far away. She had hoped that the journey to this point would be the hardest part. But now, the real challenge was just beginning. She didn't know what they would find inside, but she had to believe that it was the right decision to come. For her people, for the future. With a deep breath, she opened the door to the hovercraft and stepped onto the cold, smooth surface of the facility's floor. Ethan followed closely behind her, his eyes scanning the darkened space. The walls of the facility seemed to close in on them, as though they were entering the very heart of a forgotten world. Lyrana led the way, her steps purposeful despite the uncertainty in her heart. As they moved deeper into the facility, the soft glow of the walls illuminated the path ahead. Lyrana's hand brushed against the cool surface of the walls, feeling the ancient symbols beneath her fingers. These markings were the legacy of her people, a language that had been passed down for generations, now almost lost to time. "It's strange," Lyrana said softly, her voice echoing in the silence. "It feels like my people never left, like they're still here, watching over this place." Ethan glanced at her, his expression filled with curiosity. "Are they?" Lyrana's gaze darkened, and she shook her head. "No, they left long ago, to escape the dangers that the desolates bring. But this facility, it's meant to be our refuge, our last chance."